4,200 megawatts. That's how much generating capacity Iran's national electricity company confirmed it lost in a single stretch of strikes this summer, along with damage tracked across more than 2,000 separate points on the grid. When Tehran's own city council chairman got asked by a reporter why the blackouts were hitting without warning, he didn't dodge the question. He just said, "If you knew how many electrical facilities were bombed 2 days ago, you wouldn't be asking." That's not a rumor circulating on social media. That's an on-the-record statement from the man actually running Tehran's city council. And it tells you everything about where this country's infrastructure stands right now. Millions of people across Iran are currently living through rolling blackouts, water rationing, and fuel shortages simultaneously in the middle of a summer heat wave that's pushed temperatures past 41 degrees Celsius. And the honest, uncomfortable truth is that this crisis was already building for years before a single missile fell. What's happening right now isn't just war damage layered onto a functioning system. It's war damage layered onto a system that was already cracking under its own weight. So let's actually walk through how bad this has gotten, because the scale here is genuinely hard to overstate. Iran's national electricity company confirmed that recent strikes knocked out power at a facility on Kish Island and separately caused severe damage to distribution networks in Bandar Abbas, Jask, and Chabahar, 3 coastal cities that were already dealing with technical failures driven purely by the extreme heat before any of this military damage got added on top. On the water side, roughly 10,000 people spread across 20 villages lost their water supply entirely after a desalination plant in the coastal village of Banji got hit, a facility that existed specifically to turn seawater into drinking water for communities that don't have reliable access to fresh groundwater in the first place. And it's not just happening inside Iran's own borders either. Kuwait's Electricity, Water, and Renewable Energy Ministry reported that Iranian strikes hit one of its own power and water distillation plants, causing a fire that knocked multiple generation units offline, the second such attack on Kuwaiti infrastructure in as many days. So we're watching critical water and power infrastructure get damaged on both sides of this conflict at the same time, in a region where temperatures are already hovering well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and where water scarcity was already one of the most serious long-term threats facing the entire Middle East even before any of this started. Stick with us here, because we're going to walk through exactly how deep this crisis actually runs, from the decades of underinvestment that set the stage for this collapse, to what's happening with fuel in the Strait of Hormuz right now, to what this kind of sustained infrastructure pressure typically does to a government's ability to hold on to power. If you've been following the broader conflict and want to actually understand the mechanics behind what's happening on the ground, rather than just the headline strike numbers, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of deeper breakdown we like digging into here. And that's a critical distinction that shapes everything else in this story, because it separates a temporary wartime disruption from something closer to a structural, multi-year emergency that outlasts any single ceasefire agreement. Let's talk about the human toll for a second, because it's easy to read numbers like 4,200 megawatts and lose track of what that actually means for a person trying to live their life day to day. In Islamshar, just outside Tehran, one resident described power going out at 2 in the morning and still not being back by 5, sitting in the dark through the hottest hours of the night with no idea when it would return. University students in Tehran had their final exam servers go completely offline mid-exam because of an unannounced blackout, forcing 38 separate tests to be postponed to the following month, disrupting academic timelines for students who had no control whatsoever over any of this. One 22-year-old student described it simply, saying the blackouts have derailed and disturbed all of their plans, a sentence that captures the frustration of an entire generation trying to finish degrees and build careers in the middle of a collapsing power grid. Industrial workers are watching their own paychecks shrink as factories get limited to just 2 days of guaranteed electricity a week, with predictions that those restrictions are going to expand into evening and midnight hours as the crisis deepens further. Hospitals, the places you'd think would be protected no matter what, are operating under the same strain as everyone else, running on backup systems that were never designed to carry this kind of sustained, repeated load. This isn't an abstract geopolitical story playing out somewhere far away. It's tens of millions of ordinary people trying to keep food from spoiling, trying to keep medical equipment running, trying to finish a university exam, all while the basic infrastructure underneath their daily lives keeps failing in ways that are increasingly difficult to distinguish between war damage and years of accumulated neglect. It's also worth understanding that blackouts themselves have become something of a deliberate wartime tool in this conflict, not just an unfortunate side effect of it. Back in February, when Israeli and American strikes hit a compound in Tehran that reportedly killed several senior regime figures, internet monitoring groups tracked Iran's entire national connectivity, essentially flatlining within hours. Analysts who track that kind of digital infrastructure described it as straight out of Iran's own wartime playbook, a deliberate blackout imposed by the regime itself to prevent metadata and user-generated content from leaking the locations of surviving officials, and to guard against further strikes being coordinated using information pulled from ordinary citizens' phones and internet activity. So there are actually two separate layers of blackout happening across this country at different points in the conflict. The physical, unintentional kind caused by bombed substations and overloaded grids, and the deliberate, strategic kind imposed by the government itself as a wartime security measure. For an ordinary Iranian trying to check on family members or simply figure out when their power might come back, those two categories tend to blur together into one continuous, exhausting experience of simply not knowing what's happening or when it will end. Now let's rewind and actually trace how this specific crisis built up, because understanding the sequence here matters. Iran's electricity troubles didn't start this summer. They've been building for years, driven by chronic underinvestment in aging power plants, a national grid that was never upgraded to keep pace with rising demand, and a persistent drought that's crippled hydroelectric generation across multiple provinces. This isn't even the first time a sitting Iranian president has had to publicly apologize for exactly this kind of crisis. Back in 2021, President Hassan Rouhani stood in front of a cabinet meeting and personally apologized for a wave of blackouts sweeping the country, blaming a severe drought that had brought hydroelectric power generation to almost zero, alongside record consumption driven by both industrial growth and, notably, energy-guzzling cryptocurrency mining operations that were pulling enormous amounts of power off an already strained grid. He even acknowledged that international sanctions had choked off the investment needed to properly maintain and expand the country's energy infrastructure. That was 4 years before any of the current fighting started, and virtually every root cause he cited back then, drought, underinvestment, sanctions, driven capital shortages, is still cited by officials and analysts today. That kind of repetition tells you this was never a crisis that appeared overnight. Because of military strikes, it's a structural weakness that's been building for well over a decade, with each successive summer adding a new layer of strain on top of a system that was never given the chance to properly recover or modernize in between. Back in 2025, before any of the current military conflict even began, water shortages had already gotten so severe that university researchers were publicly warning Iran was approaching what they called a doomsday scenario, with some experts saying the country could run out of drinkable water within weeks if nothing changed. That warning sparked actual protests, starting with university students in May of that year and spreading to truck drivers, bakers, farmers, and retirees, all chanting some version of the same basic demand: water, electricity, life, our basic right. Some areas were already going without water for up to 3 consecutive days at a stretch, and that was before this year's renewed fighting added a completely new layer of physical destruction on top of an already fragile system. By early this year, Iran's own power plant association was warning that the country wouldn't even be able to generate a third of the additional electricity capacity it needed just to keep pace with growing demand, projecting a deficit of roughly 25,000 megawatts for the year ahead. That's before a single missile hit a single power plant. The chairman of that association put the ongoing capacity gap in blunt terms, noting that Iran needs to expand its generating capacity by around 6,000 megawatts every single year, just to keep up with baseline demand growth, and that even in a normal year without any war damage at all, the country wasn't on pace to reach even a third of that target. Iran's Parliamentary Research Center went even further, projecting a peak summer shortfall of 13,640 megawatts, describing available supply at around 68,000 megawatts against projected peak demand of more than 81,000 megawatts. That gap, according to their own estimate, works out to roughly a fifth of the country's total available power simply not being there when people need it most. A shortfall large enough that even perfect execution of every rationing plan on paper still wouldn't close it. And when war damage got layered onto that already existing structural deficit, the math only got worse. The same parliamentary report noted that self-supplied power plants taken offline by the conflict removed another 4,800 megawatts from the grid, disrupting production chains across major industries that depend on consistent power to function at all. The industrial fallout from all of this has been brutal and immediate. Cement manufacturers in provinces like Khorasan and Fars have reported production cuts of roughly 50%, triggering price hikes and material shortages that ripple straight into the construction sector and eventually into the cost of basic housing. Steel production across Isfahan, Yazd, and Khuzestan has been repeatedly disrupted, with companies halting entire night shifts just to stay within their allotted power budget, absorbing losses that some reports describe running into the millions of tomans per day. One former head of Iran's Chamber of Commerce, Industries, Mines, and Agriculture put a specific number on it, describing industrial zones facing blackouts of 4 to 6 hours every single day, a level of disruption that makes consistent manufacturing output almost impossible to sustain. And electricity allocations for some industries have reportedly been slashed dramatically, cut from 8 megawatts down to just 2 megawatts in specific documented cases, a reduction severe enough to functionally shut down entire production lines rather than just slow them. Workers on those production lines don't just lose hours, many lose entire shifts, and factory managers describe scrambling to reorganize entire schedules around whatever narrow windows of guaranteed power they can count on from one week to the next, a level of operational chaos that makes long-term planning nearly impossible for businesses trying to simply stay solvent through the rest of the year. Here's the honesty check on all of this, because there's a political dimension to this crisis that's just as important as the physical damage itself. Iranian officials have publicly blamed the current blackouts primarily on foreign attacks, and there's no question that recent strikes on power plants and distribution networks have made an already bad situation measurably worse. But energy analysts and even some domestic commentators inside Iran have pushed back on that framing, pointing out that these exact same problems, rolling blackouts, water rationing, industrial power cuts, were already well underway more than a year before the current round of fighting even began. Continued blackouts combined with government-driven electricity price increases have been described by domestic critics as clear signs of ineffective and incompetent economic and infrastructure policymaking that predates the war entirely. So the honest picture here isn't that Iran had a fully functional grid that got knocked out by strikes. It's that Iran had a grid already buckling under decades of underinvestment, drought-driven hydroelectric collapse, and international sanctions that choked off the foreign investment needed to modernize aging plants. And then a shooting war arrived and accelerated a collapse that was already well underway. Now, let's talk about the fuel piece of this puzzle, because it's connected to everything else in ways that make the whole situation even more precarious. The broader conflict has triggered what's being described as one of the largest global oil supply disruptions in modern history, driven primarily by the closure and restriction of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that, under normal circumstances, carries somewhere around a fifth of the entire world's oil trade. Brent crude prices surged into the $80 a barrel range within days of the conflict's earlier escalation, and that volatility has continued rippling outward ever since, hitting countries that rely heavily on Persian Gulf oil imports with fuel shortages of their own, panic buying at gas stations, and rising concerns about food security tied directly to fertilizer costs that depend on the same energy inputs. Inside Iran itself, the fuel picture is just as strained. War damage has reportedly reduced the country's gas production capacity down to around 600 million cubic meters per day, a reduction serious enough that officials are already warning about potential shortages stretching well beyond the summer and directly into the winter heating season, when gas demand for home heating typically spikes even under normal circumstances. And that's really the trap Iran finds itself caught inside right now. Electricity generation, water treatment, and fuel production aren't three separate problems. They're one interconnected system, and damage to any single piece cascades directly into the other two. Desalination plants, like the one hit in Banji, require enormous amounts of electricity to actually convert seawater into something drinkable. So when the grid goes down, water production goes down right along with it, regardless of whether the water infrastructure itself took a direct hit. Natural gas is used both for home heating and for a meaningful share of electricity generation, so damage to gas production capacity doesn't just threaten winter heating, it threatens the grid's ability to generate power at all. And fuel shortages tied to the broader Strait of Hormuz disruption affect everything from the trucks that would normally deliver repair equipment to damaged power stations, to the backup generators that hospitals and water treatment facilities rely on when the primary grid fails. When one leg of that triangle gets kicked out, the other two start wobbling almost immediately. And that's exactly the pattern showing up across Iran right now. Cities losing power, then losing water, because the pumps and treatment plants that move that water can't run without electricity, then struggling to get a fuel to backup generators because the broader transportation and energy network is under the same simultaneous strain. This crisis also isn't staying neatly contained inside Iran's own borders, and that regional spillover is worth understanding on its own terms. Kuwait has now reported at least 2 separate attacks on its own power and water distillation infrastructure within a matter of days, with its electricity, water, and renewable energy ministry describing a fire breaking out in one facility that led to several generation units being taken offline entirely. Kuwait's own military confirmed that an army barracks was struck in the same wave of attacks, with personnel injured, and Kuwait Petroleum Corporation separately reported that one of its oil installations sustained significant material damage from what it described as repeated Iranian attacks. Bahrain's Interior Ministry has reported sirens sounding as Iranian drones targeted air navigation systems, and Jordan's air defenses have had to intercept incoming projectiles as well. So this is no longer a story about a single country's infrastructure buckling under war damage. It's a regional pattern where the same core vulnerabilities, power generation, water treatment, and fuel logistics are getting hit on multiple sides of the same conflict simultaneously, in a part of the world where extreme heat already pushes every one of those systems close to its breaking point, even during peacetime. The fuel disruption tied to all of this has rippled out even further than the immediate region too. Because the Strait of Hormuz normally carries such an enormous share of global oil trade, the restrictions and attacks on shipping through that waterway have been described by the International Energy Agency as one of the largest supply disruptions the global oil market has ever experienced. That kind of shock doesn't stay contained to the Gulf. Countries thousands of miles away that depend heavily on Persian Gulf, oil imports have reported their own fuel shortages and panic buying at gas stations, with reports out of places like Vietnam describing exactly that kind of scramble as import supply chains got disrupted by the broader volatility in global energy markets. Add in rising concerns about fertilizer costs and food security tied to the same energy inputs, and you start to see how a regional infrastructure crisis inside Iran connects to grocery store prices and gas station lines on the other side of the planet. It's a genuinely global chain reaction, even though the epicenter of the actual physical damage remains concentrated in and around Iran's own coastline and its neighbors across the Gulf. Officials have responded to all of this with a mix of rationing and public appeals that, frankly, read as somewhat desperate given the scale of the actual shortfall. The Islamic Republic has told citizens it will be forced to impose electricity consumption restrictions for roughly 120 days, acknowledging bluntly that without effective ways to get people to significantly cut usage, the result is going to be widespread blackouts, regardless of what conservation measures get announced. One member of Iran's Parliamentary Planning and Budget Committee framed the entire situation in explicitly political terms, calling on citizens to cut back on electricity, water, and fuel consumption as part of the country's broader resistance effort, describing it as an economic war and telling the public that every unit of energy they personally save represents a direct challenge to what he called the enemy's economic conspiracy. That kind of rhetoric tells you something important. When a government starts framing basic household conservation as a patriotic act of resistance against a foreign conspiracy, it's usually a sign that the actual technical and financial tools needed to fix the underlying problems simply aren't available. So managing public perception becomes the fallback strategy instead. There have also been direct threats from the American side, specifically targeting this exact vulnerability. President Trump has stated publicly that unless Iran returns to negotiations, its power plants and bridges could become additional targets for future strikes. A warning that adds yet another layer of uncertainty on top of a system that's already failing under its own combined weight of heat, war damage, and years of neglect. Tehran Electricity Distribution Company officials responded to some of this uncertainty by publicly denying unofficial blackout schedules that had started circulating online. An unusual move that itself highlights just how much public anxiety and confusion has built up around when and where the next outage might hit. From Washington's perspective, that kind of pressure is designed to increase the cost of continued conflict and push Tehran back toward the negotiating table. From the perspective of ordinary Iranians already living through rolling blackouts and rationed water, it represents a very direct, very personal threat to whatever fragments of functioning infrastructure they still have access to, layered on top of a summer that was already brutal before any of this additional pressure got applied. So what actually gets Iran out of this hole, assuming the fighting eventually stops? Energy researchers advising Iranian lawmakers have pointed out that simply asking people to conserve more energy only produces short-term relief and doesn't come close to solving the structural gap. What's actually needed, according to those same researchers, includes stronger transmission infrastructure, smarter and more efficient gas turbines, meaningfully expanded solar and wind capacity, and better management of the water resources that hydroelectric generation depends on. There's also a specific, tangible project that keeps coming up in these discussions: the proposed Bakhtiari Dam, which engineers say could add roughly 2,600 megawatts of generating capacity to the national grid if it ever gets built. But that project alone would require an injection of around $500 million in foreign currency and take up to 5 years to actually complete. And one former industry official put the underlying problem bluntly, saying Iran simply doesn't have the luxury of that kind of time anymore. Even without a single additional missile falling, the country was already staring down a multi-year infrastructure gap that conservation measures alone were never going to close. And every week this conflict continues, just widens that gap further. Officials have also leaned heavily on a specific euphemism to describe what's happening, calling it load management, a technical-sounding term for what amounts to deliberately cutting power to entire regions in a rotating pattern to keep the overall grid from collapsing completely. One energy official described public conservation as essentially the only thing standing between the current situation and a full grid collapse, explaining that rising temperatures have reduced power plant efficiency across the board, partly because part of the electricity these plants generate now has to be redirected just to cool the facilities themselves down enough to keep operating. That's a genuinely vicious cycle, plants running hotter and less efficiently because of the heat, which means more of their own output gets consumed just keeping themselves from overheating, which leaves even less power available for everyone else right at the exact moment when air conditioning demand across the country is at its absolute peak. Layered on top of that technical strain is a pricing dimension that's added its own economic pain. Authorities have raised electricity prices on the country's energy exchange and imposed higher costs on both industries and ordinary citizens, even as grid stability continues to deteriorate, a combination that critics describe as economically backwards, asking people to pay more for a service that's becoming simultaneously less reliable. Domestic commentators have been blunt about what that combination signals, arguing that continued blackouts alongside rising government-set energy prices, without any corresponding improvement in actual grid stability, are about as clear a sign as you can get of ineffective and incompetent infrastructure policy, regardless of how much of the current damage gets attributed to foreign strikes and official statements. There's also a quieter economic story running underneath all of this that deserves attention, tied to how businesses are responding in real time. Iran's own Chamber of Commerce has been tracking purchasing manager surveys that show warehouses emptying out, new orders drying up, and production lines increasingly at risk of complete stoppage within just a few months if current conditions persist. That kind of survey data acts almost like taking the pulse of the entire economy, and right now that pulse is showing real strain, businesses effectively bracing for extended disruption, rather than expecting a quick return to normal operating conditions. Meanwhile, diplomatic negotiations tied to the broader conflict have reportedly opened what's been described as a renewable 60-day clock for talks to produce results. But, as one detailed economic analysis pointed out, Iran's factories may not actually have that long to wait. The gap between how quickly diplomacy typically moves and how quickly industrial capacity can erode under sustained power and water shortages is exactly the kind of mismatch that tends to produce sudden, hard-to-predict shifts in a country's internal stability, whether that shows up as renewed street protests, a wave of business closures, or simply a slow, grinding contraction of the formal economy that's much harder to capture in a single dramatic headline. Let's zoom out and talk about what sustained infrastructure collapse like this typically means for a government's grip on power, because history offers a pretty consistent pattern here. Basic services, reliable electricity, clean water, affordable fuel aren't just conveniences. They're the baseline promise almost every government makes to its population in exchange for stability and compliance. When that baseline promise starts failing repeatedly and visibly, especially during something as universally uncomfortable as a summer heat wave with temperatures pushing past 100 degrees, public patience tends to run out fast, regardless of how much blame officials try to redirect toward external enemies or foreign conspiracies. Iran's own recent history backs this up directly. The water and electricity protests of 2025 didn't start as a political movement demanding regime change. They started as students and workers simply demanding functioning water and power, and only evolved into broader systemic demands after authorities failed to meaningfully address the underlying shortages. If this current combination of war damage, heat-driven demand spikes, and years of accumulated underinvestment continues stacking up without a clear path toward resolution, that same pattern becomes increasingly likely to repeat itself, potentially at a larger and more volatile scale than what played out last year, especially with the added grievance of foreign strikes giving people an even more visceral, tangible reason to be furious about their daily circumstances. And here's the piece that ties all of this together into the bigger strategic picture. Every one of these pressure points, the electricity deficit, the water rationing, the fuel shortages tied to the Strait of Hormuz, the industrial shutdowns crushing cement and steel production, feeds directly into the broader economic squeeze that's been building against the Iranian regime throughout this entire conflict. A government that can't keep the lights on, can't guarantee clean water, and can't keep its own factories running consistently is a government operating with dramatically less leverage at any future negotiating table, regardless of how much military hardware it still has in reserve or how defiant its official rhetoric continues to sound. Whether that pressure ultimately translates into a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, into renewed and larger domestic unrest, or simply into a long, grinding period of managed scarcity that drags on for years, depends on factors well beyond just infrastructure repair. But the infrastructure itself is clearly one of the most important battlegrounds in this entire conflict, even though it rarely gets the same attention as missile strikes and fighter jet footage. There's one more angle worth considering here too, because it cuts against the assumption that infrastructure collapse automatically weakens a government's position at the negotiating table. Some regimes, facing exactly this kind of sustained internal pressure, have historically used it as justification for tightening control rather than loosening it, framing scarcity itself as proof that the outside world is waging economic war against ordinary citizens, and using that narrative to rally at least part of the population around continued defiance rather than compromise. Iran's own officials have already started leaning on that exact framing, describing conservation as resistance and shortages as an economic conspiracy imposed from outside. whether that narrative holds up under the sheer physical discomfort of extended blackouts during a summer heat wave, or whether it eventually gets drowned out by the same kind of frustration that sparked the 2025 water protests, is genuinely one of the more important open questions hanging over the second half of this conflict. Either way, the outcome of this specific struggle over electricity, water, and fuel, rather than over missiles and airspace, may end up shaping the final resolution of this war just as much as anything happening on an actual battlefield. What do you think happens from here? Do you think sustained pressure on Iran's power grid and water supply is more likely to push the regime back towards serious negotiations? Or do you think a government under this kind of strain digs in even harder and doubles down on the resistance framing instead? And do you think ordinary Iranians reach a breaking point on basic services before any kind of ceasefire or diplomatic resolution actually arrives? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question where informed opinions genuinely matter, and I want to see where people land on it. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening underneath the surface of this conflict, beyond just the strike counts and the military hardware, go ahead and hit that like button. It makes a real difference in getting this kind of grounded analysis in front of more people trying to follow this seriously. And, if you haven't already, subscribe. Because between the military side of this war and the economic and infrastructure side we just walked through, there's a lot more still unfolding, and we'll keep breaking it down as it develops. Share this with anyone you know who's been following the strikes but hasn't seen the full picture of what's happening to the water, electricity, and fuel underneath it all, because that side of the story matters just as much as anything happening in the skies above Iran. It's the side of the war that doesn't come with dramatic strike footage, but it's the side that's likely to determine how millions of ordinary people actually experience the coming months, long after any individual night of strikes fades from the headlines. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.